but not this one. And you have no classes at all on Monday, the 8th, right? Okay. So we were looking at early Renaissance Italy. Remember that we break up the Renaissance in Italy into three distinct periods. The really, really early stuff, the proto stuff. And we call it proto because it's not really cooking yet, you know? Giotto, Duccio, Simone Martini. And then there's the early Renaissance, which is what we're looking at now, the 15th century, where we start to see an interest in classical style, right? They're actually looking back at ancient Roman art at this point, right? Which they really weren't doing in Giotto and Duccio's age as much, right? Maybe the realism, but not the actual figures. And we're also seeing an increase in rationalism through perspective, through study of anatomy, right? Anatomy studied through Greek sculptures. We'll look more at that today. Right? And then we're going to move to the High Renaissance, which we'll get to later today, which is the Renaissance people you've always heard of. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, right? That's the end of it, right? That's the full culmination of it. So looking at the early Renaissance in Italy, the 15th century, we were talking on Thursday about the degree to which the century, certainly 2/3 of it, 3/4 of it, is dominated by the leadership, or I should say the influence of the Medici family, right? Because they really were not elected leaders, but they certainly did influence politics, and for us, more importantly, art in 15th century Florence. And the early Renaissance really does stay primarily in Florence. Rome isn't really part of it yet. And there's kind of a reason for that, in that the papacy, remember we talked how the papacy had gone to Avignon, to France, back in the 14th century? Well, they only moved back to Italy in the early part of the 15th century, and they're not really settled yet, which means they're not really major patrons of the arts until the end of the 15th century, right? And that's why, one of the reasons why Florence becomes this great hotbed of early Renaissance art. So we're looking at two different works here from the National Gallery, both of which are, one is certainly and one is probably Medici patronage, right? The Madonna and Child made for their private use, which Medici we're not sure. It's right around the time that Cosimo died in 1464, so it could be him, it could be his son, right? But those are the Medici coat of arms in the lower left corner on the Virgin's throne. That's kind of swanky. She's sitting on a Medici throne, right? And then the Adoration of the Magi, there is a work very much like this listed in the Medici family inventory. And there are little details about it that suggest that it might have been the Medici, made for the Medici, including the fact that both artists, Fra Angelico and Fra Filippo Lippi, worked on other Medici projects. So that's one part of it. The other part is that there are certain elements of it that seem to quote from the Strozzi altarpiece that Cosimo de' Medici had co-opted, right, after driving Paolo Strozzi out of Florence. It became his own work. So these things suggest that it might well be a Medici work. Again, we're not 100% sure. We have one last Medici work to look at before we move into the High Renaissance of the 16th century. And that's another work by Donatello. You remember that you did some works, you studied some works by Donatello in one of the worksheets, worksheet 4 I think it was. We looked at works by Donatello that he did for Or San Michele, but he also was one of the favored sculptors of the Medici family. And the work on your left was a Medici commission that sat in their palace, right? So it belonged to the Medici family. And so just as a quick reminder, right, there's our two other Donatellos that we saw in the worksheet, the St. Mark and the St. George. You'll notice as look at all three of them that he's able to sort of shift his style from work to work, from the sort of fierce, I won't say anger, but determination of St. Mark in the middle, to the sort of stoic nature of St. George, to the almost effeminate image of David on the left. Donatello is a fantastic chameleon when it comes to his style in his different works. And so you remember the two on the left, or excuse me, on the right, were mounted outside of this old grain hall where the major guilds of Florence met, and each one of the guilds was responsible for filling the niche on the outside with their patron saint. And Donatello did actually 3 of them. We only looked at 2. Other sculptors filled the rest. This was part of a major awakening in Florence to sculptural art. We hadn't really seen a lot of sculpture throughout the Middle Ages. The David actually went right inside the Medici Palace. Now, there's another statue there, but there's a doorway you can see behind that existing statue that goes out to the street, and it sat here in the courtyard. This is right when you come off the street before you go into the private rooms of the Medici Palace, right? And the architect Michelozzo is the same architect that did the monastery of San Marco, where Fra Angelico lived, right? And similar architectural style that we saw in that Annunciation by Fra Angelico, right? So it's inside, and it means it's kind of a private work, but only kind of semi-private, because anybody who visited the Medici family would have seen David on entering the palace, right? And there was the reason the Medici wanted it inside their palace is kind of twofold. One, well, we'll talk about the second one in a bit. First, there was a law in Florence that no one could erect a public monument on the streets of Florence. No individual. The city could, but the individuals could not, right? So this is how the guilds could get away with those statues on Or San Michele, but a freestanding statue on the streets of Florence was forbidden for any individual to do that because Florence didn't see themselves as a city that was run by individuals. They saw themselves as a democracy, a republic, and that would fly in the face of that. So the Medici want a monument, and they're kind of forced by the laws of Florence to put it inside their palace. The second issue is that metaphorically, being inside the palace, Donatello's David speaks a kind of interesting propaganda message almost. Because David was the slayer of Goliath, right? David took on an enemy larger than himself, and at the time he was a teen, and that's why Donatello makes him look somewhat effeminate, right? Is to emphasize that his teenager status, right? The lack of developed musculature. And Florence looked at David, and they said, "This reminds me of me." The Florentines did, because Florence was often involved in battles against more mighty enemies. The city of Milan, for example, had a significantly larger army, and they fought against them, and they won. The city of Siena, they were in a long-standing battle with the city of Siena. There were multiple times in their more recent history, within the last 50 years or so, that the city of Florence could look at their history and say, we met up with a Goliath and we won. Right? And so what they started to think is that they were sort of modern political Davids. Right? David became a symbol for the city of Florence. He's not the patron saint because he's not a saint. Right? He's an Old Testament figure from the Hebrew Bible, right? Their patron saint was John the Baptist. But he is for them a role model, an analogy, right? For what they saw to be their primary character trait, which is the ability to fight stronger enemies and win, right? So the Medici, commissioning from Donatello an image of David, are really telling anybody that comes to this Medici, we're Florence, right? If David is Florence and the Medici own a David, then the Medici own Florence, right? Now, that's something you can't put on the street. So having it inside the palace also makes sense because of this symbolic analogy between not only David and Florence, but now the Medici in Florence as well, via the mediator of David, right? Now, again, as we're talking about the early Renaissance, this sort of second phase, the 15th century, one of the things we've been talking about is this interest, this stronger interest in looking back at ancient Roman art, right? And the Romans, and they often copied Greek art as well, right? And Donatello is certainly part of that. And I think this came out in the in the worksheet that you did on him as well. But certainly here we can see that the contrapposto pose of the David, and indeed the soft modeling of the muscles, comes out of a sculptor that he was particularly fond of, Praxiteles, who was renowned for being able to model flesh. And Donatello picks up that sort of soft musculature, and how both Praxiteles and Donatello are able to make something that's hard and cold, stone, marble, or bronze, cast bronze, make it look as if it's supple and pliable. Right? They're really able to sort of transform it into looking very much like skin. And so Donatello, looking back now again at ancient, these are Greek examples, but Roman copies. And for them, the Greco-Roman world was all this great heritage for them. Right? So he's definitely picking up on that. And that's part of that hallmark of the early Renaissance, is that renewed interest in Roman body types, right, coming through. And for Donatello, various examples for various commissions, not always the same ones. Now, the technique for bronze casting, this is something, I've never done it, right? So I'm a little vague on this. But the term we use for is lost wax bronze casting. And with the diagram on your right, which is sort of nicked offline somewhere, what we see is the way you do it. Yeah, you start off by sculpting the figure in a different medium, usually with some sort of matrix over which you build the outside surface, okay? So A and B is the matrix with the outside surface. You then coat the outside surface with plaster, leaving air holes, right? You then heat it up. This is now D at the bottom, and all of the surface that you put over the matrix melts away. Usually you used wax, right? That would then melt out, and what you'd have through the pins and the air holes is a nice little pocket inside that you could then fill with anything, right? This is how they make chocolate Easter bunnies, right? So, things like that, right? Kinder Bueno, right? Any kind of empty, hollow chocolate shell, right, will be made the exact same way. Probably how they cast things like, plastic shells for, McDonald's hamburgers, right? Probably the same process, right? So in D, you've melted the wax out. That's what we call it, lost wax. And E, you pour in the bronze. And it makes it hollow, even though it's going to still weigh like 2 tons. A life-size statue will still weigh like 2 tons. It's hollow, right, but saving bronze, because bronze is extraordinarily expensive, right? And also, of course, extraordinarily heavy. Imagine if your car was solid rather than just the exterior, right? How heavy that would be. Even if it was just like a motorcycle, right? That's about the same size. And then what you do is, of course, you chip away the outside. I guess if you're really careful, right, you could save it and do it again, right? Depending on what you want to do with the bronze. So if you want to do multiples. Do you ever see Rodin's Thinker? Right? And there's 100 of these around. It's because the mold was preserved, right? But for Donatello's David, there's just the one. So you crack it apart. You then remove the interior. And again, this is where I'm a little vague as to how you get the stuff on the inside out, right? What was once inside of it. And you then work on the surface. You have to sort of shave at it. You've got to file it a bit, polish it, and then you treat it. Because, bronze is not that color naturally, right? Bronze is yellow. It looks like gold, right? It looks like brass, okay? So what you do is you treat it with various chemicals to give it the color you want, whether that color is this or it can even turn slightly green like you see down below, right? So this is a technique. Now, Donatello's David was the first, I hate things that are first and biggest and best, right? But nonetheless, it was the very first time we have a recorded 3-dimensional sculpture in the round, not attached to a building and life-size for about 1,000 years, right? This was a hallmark of Roman art. But during the Middle Ages, they stopped doing it because it was too much like trying to be God, You know, you're making a full-size human figure. That's what God does. And so there was kind of a hesitancy to go there, right? You might see large statues, but they would be attached to buildings. This one was freestanding. Even though it was in the Medici Palace, it's not stuck inside a niche, right? Like Donatello's other works were. Those were part of architecture. This was freestanding, independent, and the very first one for roughly 1,000 years, which is pretty phenomenal in itself, right? Talk about reviving ancient Rome. Not only are we using Roman techniques, Roman body types, but we're also going to make a kind of statue that no one has seen since ancient Rome, right? Rome is reborn here. So Donatello's David is really an incredibly important work this way. And like I said, he's carved in fully in the round. Remember the worksheet on Donatello St. Mark where he's not carved on the back? Because he knew it was going to be in a niche and nobody would see it, so he didn't have to bother with that stuff, right? This one is carved fully in the round. You can walk around it. You can look at it from the back, even though I think he wants you to see it from this viewpoint. In fact, if you just do a Google search for Donatello David, one, you'll find 2 other ones, because he did 3 of them. But when you see this one, you see this view, right? That's because he sort of designed it to be seen from one side, right? But you can walk around it, and I've got some slides of that, right? To walk around, you can see how what Donatello is trying to do is to show us King David as this adult teenager, right? Because King David was only a teen when he did this. And for Donatello, what he's doing is he's showing us the fact that this David doesn't have the human strength necessary to do what he's done. This David needs the help of God. He has to rely on the intervention of God in order to defeat Goliath. And so what he wants to do is to emphasize just how unsuperhero-like David is, right? He's not some big hulking mass of muscles, right, that can do this. He's somebody who needs help. And to add to that, he makes him naked, right? Again, he's not outfitted for battle, even though he does have a sword, shin guards. I like to call them booties because that's kind of what they look like. And a little hat, right? But beyond, or helmet, right? But beyond that, he's not really dressed to step into battle, right? So all of this, he's manipulating what the story tells us in order to emphasize the nature of David needing the intervention of God in order to pull off this defeat. And the primary way he does it, other than the nakedness, is to focus on the softness of his body, right? And that is a motif he works with. And this is kind of an uncomfortable sculpture in a way because it is so delicate and soft. And there's something about the way he treats the sculpture that makes it where he's emphasizing the softness. So if we read the sculpture, if we look at it more closely, we can tell that this is a very particular moment in the story. So do you know the story of David and Goliath, right? Goliath is I don't know it exactly, but Goliath is the warrior on the other side. David is with the Israelites. Goliath is a giant, right? Or so the story goes. And David is able to use his sling to knock Goliath down, and then he beheads him. Then he cuts off his head, right? So we all remember the sling, but we forget the cutting off the head part, right? And so what Donatello gives us is a very particular moment in the story. It's over, right? The battle is won. And he has killed Goliath, and he's standing on his head, right? So the contrapposto pose, where the relaxed leg is actually sitting right on the head of Goliath. And you can see it down there. He's got his helmet on. You can see his beard. You can see his face. He's pulled out his sword. Now he's sort of relaxing afterwards. And he's okay, now what? It's Miller time. You know, it's over and done with. And he's sort of contemplating what it's all about. But at the same time, as he's contemplating, I think I have a slide coming up, he doesn't look particularly profoundly affected by it. I mean, think of what he's just done, right? He's severed this guy's head. And he's standing on it, and the look on his face is like, you know. Okay, guys, come on. Yeah, Sophie.
How tall is he?
He's roughly life size, a little bit short. I mean, depending on your life size, like 5'4", right? So he's the better part of life size. He's not huge because he's, again, right, he's supposed to be a kid. So the idea is, of course, to not make him, I'm not tall, but I'm 5'9", right? He's shorter than me. So then the idea is, of course, he's an adolescent, right? Yeah. Now with this idea, so he's still got a stone in his hand, right? Because that's necessary for the story. But the idea is that he's this youth. And so we get these sort of Goldilocks hair, right? Cascading down. And you see they sort of lightly touch his shoulders. It's really kind of almost erotic in the way that he's focusing on the sense of touch throughout. And I have a detail that I didn't see this when I was taking class when I was you, but look at the feather that's coming off of Goliath's helmet. Yeah. Right up the inside, the soft inside of his thigh. Like all that's got to tickle, all the way up there. But again, he wants us to be aware of the softness, right? It's all about soft touch. And that emphasizes it even more, right? That idea. And again, it's kind of, right, a little bit uncomfortable. With the idea of touch, two other things I mentioned. His face seems relatively unaffected by all of this. You can see some of what we call the chasing, how he scraped at the bronze after it came out of the casting. You see the lines on the side of his face. But also, this is also equally uncomfortable for me. Look at what he's doing with his foot. He's got it right on the neck, the bloody stump of Goliath's neck. And he's fidgeting. He's got the hair of Goliath's beard sort of wrapped around his big toe. And he's just sort of playing with it, with his feet, in this bloody, matted, disgusting. And again, touch, right? The softness of touch. And if you remember back to the worksheet with the St. Mark, remember how he also he's standing there like this, and he's playing with the fabric with his relaxed hand. If you go back and look at that St. Mark, right, Donatello's really good about making these figures who fidget, right? And he wants them to have a sort of inner energy that can't be sort of frozen, And so St. Mark plays with his linen robe because the Linen Guild, right, commissioned it, and so it calls attention to that. And here, his David does the same thing with his relaxed leg. It's not relaxed, right? It's fidgeting, and it's playing with that beard. And again, giving a sense of the inner life of the figure, but also using it as a sort of a motif that runs poetically through the work about touch, right? Soft touch, whether it's the foot, whether it's the light way he holds the rock, that feather, his hair on his shoulders, right? These are all about the softness of his skin and thus the vulnerability of David, as someone who definitely needs the help of God in order to defeat Goliath. Well, like I said, this was commissioned from the Medici family. Other families also commissioned statues of David. So down in the National Gallery, we have one commissioned by the Martelli family. And you can see it's totally based on the Donatello. Right? It's by different sculptors. And he's moved some things around. One of our Rossellino brothers has moved some things around, right? Instead of having the sword, he's still got the sling, right? But, the arm on the hip, he's clothed rather than naked. Maybe they didn't want the nudity. Certainly they didn't want the nudity, but why, we don't know. But still has his contrapposto rested leg right on the head of Goliath, right? And the Martelli family, we know, were actually allies with the Medici, right? Friends of the Medici. So if you think about like the Godfather metaphor or, mob metaphors, they were made, right? They were a made family. And they commissioned this work, we're pretty sure, to show their allegiance to the Medici family, right? Having a statue like this in their palace would say, yes, we are on the same side as the Medici. But also they could say, yes, but it also means that we are good Florentines, right? Because Florence is David. Finally, also at the National Gallery, it's a one-of-a-kind object. It's a painting, but it's on leather. And it's mounted to a shield with straps on the back so it could be carried like a military shield, right? And you can see it's slightly rounded, right, like shields are, and it is the only object of its type that exists anywhere in the world. There are other painted shields from the Renaissance, but none of them have human figures on them. They just have decorations, right? And it's far too swank to ever have been carried into battle. The whole point of the shield is to carry it in a parade, right? A military parade, like what our president wants, right? And this would be carried then in the military parade. And of course, it makes sense for a Florentine to have something like this on the shield. But the fact that it's a one-off, so far as we know, the only one that survives anyway, suggests that maybe someone special had it. Why don't we have more examples of this? Right? So could it have been made for a member of the Medici family? Could it have been made for someone from the city, a representative of city government? And again, we don't know, right? But it does show to us one more example of how important David was to the people of Florence as a symbol, right? And how that was co-opted by the Medici family to show that they were the best representatives of Florence. One last thing about it, now we can see it straight on, right? He's still got the sling. There's the head of Goliath looking for other enemies. It's based on Roman sculpture as well. Right? This is I forget, he's called the pedagogue, but about a 2nd century AD Roman sculpture on the left, or in the center, right? And you can see that Castagno, Andrea del Castagno's pose, is based directly on this. And again, that's something we've seen growing, is that interest in looking back at ancient Roman sculpture as the basis for the composition, right? For Giotto and Duccio, all they got from Rome was realism, right? Now we're getting body types and poses, right? That add into this growing sense of rationality. Okay, we're going to continue now as moving sort of late 15th century into the 16th century, into what we often call the High Renaissance, where everything sort of falls together. The famous Birth of Venus, which we saw very briefly in class a week ago, was commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici's grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, who was a major art patron in the 1480s and early 90s before he got kicked out of Florence too. Lorenzo was not only an art patron, a political leader, he was a poet and a philosopher, and he's often referred to in his own time and by historians as Lorenzo the Magnificent, right? Because he really seemed to be a moving force in bringing things together at the end of the 15th century. And the Birth of Venus, the famous Birth of Venus by Botticelli, was probably commissioned by Lorenzo for the marriage of his cousin, whose name was also Lorenzo de' Medici, right? They have names they like, right? St. Lawrence was one of their patron saints, and so Lorenzo comes up a lot, right? It's just to confuse you, right? Like all the Philips of Burgundy, right? We had Philip the Good and Philip the Bold. I didn't even get to Philip the Fair, right? Or Philip the Second, who we'll see later, or Philip the Fourth. There's too many of them out there, right? They're quite limited in imagination when it comes to choosing names, right? Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, commissioned this, we're pretty sure, as a decoration for the wedding of his cousin Lorenzo as well. And we think that because it's actually painted on canvas. And very few pictures in the 15th century were painted on canvas. Most of them were painted on wood, right? And in addition to that, it's a fairly simplified composition. The background, for example, exists, but it's rendered in a rather simplistic way. And really what you get are those 4 foreground figures making up the majority of the composition, right? That suggests a sort of backdrop to something else, right? And for a wedding, well, Venus is the goddess of love, and this is the moment of her birth when she's been blown to shore. So what a great decoration for a wedding party. And also, swankier than you and I can, because it's the Medici family, right? So of course it's swankier than you or I could ever afford, right? Now, we've seen Botticelli working for the Medici. He's one of their favorite artists, right, in the later part of the 15th century. So our little Madonna and Child devotional image for the Medici, and here a very non-devotional image, right? It's, in fact, the exact opposite. We've moved from something sanctified and holy and meant to inspire piety to something that's about love and lust, right? And something that is totally non-Christian, pagan in its subject matter, right? Venus, the Roman goddess of love, to decorate a wedding. Right? And because it was made for the Medici, Botticelli takes as a symbol for the image of Venus a statue that belonged to the Medici. Her pose and her body is based on an ancient Roman statue that the Medici had in their collection, the Medici Venus. From, I think it's a 2nd century copy of a 4th century BC work. And you can see the pose adapted from this, modeled after it, obviously adding nicer hair, right? Using that to cover up part of her nakedness. But the placement of the feet, the placement of the knees, the articulation of the abdomen is all really spot on from this ancient Roman example. And that's because the Medici would have loved that. This is our Venus, right? Reappearing here now in this work. Now, the story of the birth of Venus is that she, I think we mentioned this in class, right? She was born when a god's body intermingled with the earth, right? So, the god of time, Kronos, castrated the god Uranus, after whom the planet is named, right? And his castrated testicles fell into the ocean. And that is what gave birth to Venus, right? That from that mingling of the semen, right, with the earth. And Roman mythology will even tell you that's why, this is disgusting, but that's why you get sea foam. Yeah, I know, Jason. Not last time I go wading in the ocean, knowing that, right? So here we see after that, after the mingling of God and earth, Venus is then blown to shore, right? And that's what Botticelli gives us, is the moment that she's welcomed on shore. And so what we have on the left are two personifications of the wind, right? In other words, these are the winds that blow her to shore. And that's a standard Roman artistic theme, to use the human figure to personify nature, right? And so here are they, you see their cheeks are blown out. Even he's a little red in the face, right? Blowing really hard as they are now blowing her to earth, and her hair blows away from her in the direction of their breath. All these beautiful roses, right, flitting around. They look like the one that the Virgin Mary was holding in Giotto's picture, right? They're the same sort of pink rose that you see, but they're everywhere across the surface as they sort of blow in. And even though they're meant to be providing a wind that blows her in, it's very gentle, isn't it? Right? Despite his red-faced, blown cheek, Duke Ellington sort of look with this wind god. And on the opposite shore, she's being welcomed by the goddess of springtime, right? A personification of spring itself. And she's gonna dress her up, right? She's gonna cover her nakedness. So she's got this amazing sort of purple, pink robe with an orange hem, and you can see the neckline just above her hand there. She's gonna throw that around her shoulders, right? Cover her up for propriety as she's welcomed on shore, because what it means, of course, is that we get to see what we're not supposed to see, because she'll get covered up and taken to public, right? But you Medici people at this wedding are given this unbroken view, if you will, of Venus coming to shore. And so she is springtime, and she wears around her waist a belt made of flowers, and she has flowers, of course, all over her robe, as well as all over the robe that she's giving to the Virgin Mary. Or excuse me, to Venus. That was a weird slip, right? So this looks entirely non-Christian, right? It's all Roman gods. It's entirely Roman mythology. It's Roman body types. There's really kind of nothing much Christian left here. And this adoption of Roman subject matter is a hallmark of sort of the third phase of the Renaissance, that we begin to see more open, free use of non-Christian subject matter. of Roman subject matter. And that's one of many hallmarks of the High Renaissance, right? This culmination when everything comes together, everything we've been seeing develop ever since Giotto sort of begins to reach its climax around the year 1500, right? And historians call this period the High Renaissance. It's not like a date that it starts at, right? But usually 1490s through 1520s is what we talk about with the High Renaissance. And even though it's non-Christian subject matter, anybody in the 15th century would have made analogies between pagan religion and Christianity, because it was ostensibly a Christian society, right? More overtly Christian society. And so they would have remembered the things we talked about before when we looked at Fra Filippo Lippi's work, that yes, we can look at Venus and we can remember elements of the theology behind the Virgin Mary, right? In the same way that we can look at the Virgin Mary and remember elements of the mythology behind Venus, right? And the prominent philosophical movement of the day, Neoplatonism, emphasized these connections. And it's worth mentioning here that the Medici were deeply involved with Neoplatonism. Lorenzo de' Medici, the guy who paid for this picture, ran an academy that studied Neoplatonism out of the Medici palace. Right? They met there regularly. Neoplatonic philosophers, poets, even young Michelangelo, right? Botticelli, met on the Medici grounds, hosted by Lorenzo, to talk about Neoplatonic ideas. So when Botticelli paints something like this for the Medici, the idea that we are meant to look at the Virgin Mary and think about all sorts of analogies, some of them to Christianity, some of them to other sort of esoteric ideas. One thing they said about Venus was that she's a metaphor for how ideas grow in our minds, right? They come out of nowhere, sort of, gods inspire us and we come up with ideas. And that's like how Venus was born. Right? These are the sorts of analogies they would make at the Neoplatonic Academy. So Botticelli is definitely tapping into that. Leonardo. We have the only Leonardo painting anywhere in the Americas. The only one anywhere, right? Canada, Mexico, South America. The only one, right? The vast majority in Europe, right? But we've got the one and only. And that's why she's often the cover girl for almost everything the National Gallery does, right? It's because we are very, very fortunate to have this picture. Leonardo, see the date's roughly similar to Botticelli, right? And he and Botticelli are roughly contemporaries. Botticelli's a little bit older, right? Botticelli dies maybe 10 years before Leonardo does, right? But they both die fairly young. They studied together under the same artist, right? So remember how artists learned to paint was they would apprentice under a master, right? And a master would often have 4 or 5 pupils with him at any given time. That's nice because you make them do the crappy stuff, right? And then you do the good stuff at the end. Well, both Botticelli and Leonardo were pupils under the same artist at exactly the same time, right? And they both moved out to become independent artists at roughly the same time as well. Now, for Botticelli, it was his second teacher, because remember he studied under Filippo Lippi, right? After leaving Lippi's shop, he went to finish his apprenticeship under somebody else, right? And it was this somebody else, Andrea del Verrocchio. You won't be tested on that, right? But that's who they studied together under, right? And this is one of Leonardo's earliest independent works after leaving the tutelage, after leaving his studies under Verrocchio, next to Botticelli. It's a square picture, as you can see here, but it was not originally these dimensions. It's been trimmed down. It's been cut, and parts of it are missing, right? We have a set of drawings in another museum, and based on all of Leonardo's other portraits, we know that it was probably about this dimension. Right? And we put the hands like this because there's this wonderful drawing of hands that we think might well have been part of this composition. Right? Before I go further, I keep calling him Leonardo because Da Vinci means from Vinci, from the town of Vinci. Right? And the reason he's called Leonardo da Vinci is he was born out of wedlock. He was a bastard child. And so instead of being given his father's name, right, he was given the name of the town he was born in. And that's why people who know anything about the Renaissance call him Leonardo. Because otherwise you're calling him from Vinci, right? Like I'm Mark from Portland, right? Originally that's how I identify myself. And to call me from Portland would be stupid, right? Da Vinci doesn't make sense. Lots of people are from Vinci. He is Leonardo, is the best thing to refer to him as. I think that's how I put him on your slide sheet as well. Not that you'd be wrong if you said Da Vinci, but you'd be wrong if you said Da Vinci. You know what I mean? You wouldn't be wrong on the exam. Okay, so originally it was larger, trimmed down. We're not 100% sure why. Most certainly it seems that it would have been probably damaged. And they cut off the damaged part, right? Flood, fire, who knows, right? But what we have now is only a fragment of the original, right? The portrait was painted around the late 1470s. We think it was painted as a gift at the time of her wedding, right? Commissioned to be given to probably her husband at the time of their wedding, and that's why we date it around this time. It could have been done after the wedding as a gift as well. Could have been commissioned by the married couple themselves, but there's some reasons we think it wasn't, and we'll see those coming up. Leonardo surrounds the picture. And this is kind of nice because it's you can see it's not in the best of shape. Leonardo is tough, right, for me to talk about because he's probably like the smartest guy that ever lived, and I'm not, right? So what can I tell you? What can I possibly tell you about it? You know, that I can get in there somehow. But we do know certain things about him, and one of the things we know about him is that he was a relentless investigator of how to do things. Right? So he's making drawings all the time about how things worked. Sometimes it's machinery, sometimes it's nature. Just relentlessly engaged with investigating, finding out how things work. And that also came into play with painting techniques. He was interested in also how to paint, and he was investigating new ways. He was following the sort of standard ways. And it often meant that they become a mess. And you can see how it's wrinkling up here, right, off the surface. He thinks he knows a better way. I'll try this. And 4 times out of 5 doesn't work. Right? So we're looking back here, and we see the landscape behind her, which you can see is kind of mysterious and misty, right? And how certain forms seem to sort of meld into others. So if we look at the edge of the river here, right, where my shadow of my hand is, you can see that this tree over here, the one in the center, it's kind of hard to tell where the base of the tree is, where the shadow of the shore is, or even where the shore turns into water. That things seem to meld together, right? You can also see, I don't know how well you can see it, but his fingerprints are lots of places where there are his fingerprints on the picture. Here's one here. I think I've got a better one coming up later, but you can see that right through there. It's the palm print, right, into the wet paint with his hand. He wrote about what he was trying to do with this, and he called this kind of lighting smoky light, or sfumato, smoky light. And he said that he preferred this kind of light, this kind of haziness in his pictures, because it meant that you couldn't make out every detail. And that meant that if you tried to understand, for example, this bit of landscape moving back, right, this waterscape moving back, that you didn't get it by simply observing it, that you got it because it would be put together in your mind. You know, you would sort of bring something to it and complete the picture in a way. Does that make sense? Right? In other words, he's not going to spell it out in sort of Jan van Eyck detail, right? Crisp, sharp outlines, right? And what happens is as you look your way back there, you do understand how the water moves its way back, but at the same time, you're sort of interpolating a lot of that, right? It's completing inside your mind. And as you look at the picture, the more you look at it, things sort of emerge from shadows or fade back into shadows, and it's almost as if the picture changes as we look at it, right? We understand more. We see deeper into the shadows the longer we look. And Leonardo loved that idea of things emerging and sinking back in to the shadows. And he does it all the time in his works, right? And part of it comes out of Neoplatonism, that philosophical trend. On one level, yes, they associated different religious manifestations, but on the other hand, one of the things that Plato had said originally was that truth and beauty and perfection only exist as ideas. They don't exist in the world around us, right? That Plato says it's about metaphysics. So on the Raphael worksheet, Plato's pointing up, right? Because he thinks that's where understanding comes from, not from observation. And that becomes a hallmark of Neoplatonism. New interest in Plato is this idea of how do we emphasize works of art that focus on your mental acuity. And Leonardo's Sfumato gets us there, right? You complete it inside your mind. Yeah? Some nice details. Curls of her hair. You have to ignore the reflection on the glass there, but you can see how they seem to swirl out of the darkness and then kind of back into it again. So that he doesn't complete, even though he does paint some things lock for lock, at a certain point it gets obscured as she sort of melds into the landscape that surrounds her, right? One of the things that I've always been struck with, and I've not seen enough people write about this, is the degree to which when Leonardo paints, it's almost like he sees things as if they were swirls of water. And all of the curls of her hair seem to look like waves sort of running over rocks. And we see that in a lot of his pictures where it'll come out that it looks like he's thinking about it in terms of water. Right? So I mentioned Neoplatonism talks about the fact that truth only exists in your mind. Perfection only exists in your mind. So if Leonardo can leave things for you to complete in your mind, the picture's better that way than if it was fully completed by Leonardo, because it gets completed in your mind. In this case, it plays a secondary role because the plant that's around the outside of her, this sort of spiky plant, right, that she's framed against, is a juniper plant, right? And she melds into the juniper plant. Well, juniper is, in Italian, is Ginevra, right? That's her name, is Juniper. So he's using this sfumato for a sort of much more direct kind of analogy, right? That, in fact, she is her surrounding. She's part of that surroundings. Right? There's another thumbprint here. Right. See that pretty clearly off to the side. He's got some of the juniper on his hand, right, and brought back in. Now, like I said, we think it was commissioned for her wedding or maybe just for the married couple. And the reason we think her husband didn't commission it is because it's painted on the back. Right? So it's meant to be seen sort of standing open. It may have been part of a diptych. We're not sure. Right? Probably not. But certainly there's something on the outside of it. And there is an interlaced laurel branch, bay leaf on the left, with a palm branch and a sprig of juniper in the middle. Ha, there's her name again, right? The red thing in the upper right corner is a later collector's stamp, not part of what Leonardo painted. And Leonardo painted it with this sort of marbleizing speckles, right? You can see at the bottom how badly damaged it is, which is why we're sure that's why it was carved down, right? And it says, what is that? My Latin is so bad, right? I always get it backwards what it says, and I want to get it right. Beauty adorns virtue, right? Virtutum forma decorat. Beauty adorns virtue. In other words, a virtuous nature will lead to a beautiful face, right? She's beautiful because she's virtuous, right? That's what the scroll means at the bottom. So that's her, right? She is beautiful because she's virtuous. And it's punctuated with this bound pair of sprigs, bay leaf and palm branch. And those were the coat of arms of a poet who was a diplomat from the city of Venice in northern Italy, a diplomat to Florence, and very, very good friends with Ginevra de' Benci. Right? Those are his coats. So this is his gift to them, right? On the event of their wedding. And the gift reflects the giver, right? So this is early Leonardo. He's in Florence. He trained in Florence alongside Botticelli, right? Strikes out on his own in the 1470s. In 1482, Leonardo moves from Florence to the city of Milan in northern Italy. The name will come up in a bit. The Duke of Milan was looking for a court painter. We talked about court painters before, right? This is this job at court where your job as a painter is just to make works of art for the Duke, right? So Jan van Eyck had a job like that for Philip the Good, right? Klaus Sluter with Philip the Bold. Nice gig because, you get to live in a palace, right? You get a retainer, you get extra money whenever there's something to do. Right? And Leonardo had heard that the Duke of Milan was looking for a court painter, and he writes him a letter, the application letter. Hi, my name is Leonardo, right? Here's what I can do for you, right? I'm a man of many talents, right? He's in his 20s. Man of many talents. I can design armaments. I can build fortifications. Right? I can study the weather. I can divert rivers. Right? On and on he goes about all these things. I'm a sculptor of the first rank. And sculpted. No. And by the way, I'm also a painter. Right? This is false humility. Right? And he gets hired in 1482. He gets hired. He leaves Florence and goes to Milan for like the next 17 years. He spends in the city of Milan working as the court painter for the Duke. Okay? The painting on the right, which is in Paris, was one of the paintings he made as court painter for the Duke. And it was for a confraternity that the Duke gave money to, a religious group, right, for their altar. And it was supported by the Duke. And they were devoted to the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception. You know what that means? It means the Virgin herself was born from a virgin. So her mother, St. Anne, was also a virgin. And this is a relatively new theology in the 15th century. It's fairly set now, right? That Mary herself was born without sin, right? And that had to happen because St. Anne, her mom, had to have the same experience she did. Okay? The Immaculate Conception of the Virgin. And his way of showing us that is to show her inside this grotto, right, that she seems to emerge from the smoky light out of, because she's sort of born from the earth itself, right? So this is an altar. It's huge, 6 or 7 feet tall, done now for the Duke of Milan. Now, it's difficult to read. I mean, the Virgin Mary is easy to pick out, but we've got 2 children and an angel. Let me move my chair here so you can see the angel better. And you'll notice no halos. How do we know that's an angel? It almost looks like just a figure with a red robe, right? And that's because what Leonardo's doing is he's using that sfumato lighting, that smoky light that he likes, to hide things, right? So there is a wing on the angel, but it just sort of melds into the smoky rocks behind it, right? And now you can see it a little bit better rising up behind the angel, but you can also notice how the head of the angel just sort of disappears back into the shadow, back into the smoke behind it, right? So again, he's using his sfumato everywhere. We see it especially in the landscape behind, where those really strange rocks somewhat look like the Italian Alps, and Milan is right at the base of the Alps, right? Sort of meld into the smoke in the background. And when Leonardo paints, right, it's like he hides more than he reveals. That he wants us to be able to look at it and go, I'm not sure entirely what's going on here, right? So sfumato. Right? Now, two boys with the Virgin Mary. We know who one of them has to be, right? Jesus, right? Definitely. Who do you suppose the other one is? Anybody have any guesses?
Moses?
Sorry, the other boy?
No.
Moses? That would be great if it were a more symbolic picture, but there's somebody who's a rough contemporary of Jesus. Jason has his hand up first. John the Baptist, right? John the Baptist is Jesus' cousin. Okay? And he's like 6 months older than Jesus, right? In the Bible story. They look pretty much the same age here. Okay? Now you'll notice that just like Leonardo hides the angel's wings, he also doesn't give us halos. So the question is, which one's which? Can you tell? Which one's Jesus and which one's John?
The one that is with the angel, that's Jesus.
And why? Okay, so Menor thinks the one with the angel is Jesus. Do people agree, disagree? You disagree. Okay, so let's hear why Menor thinks why, and then we'll go to see what Menor, why?
So because the angel is present there means that that's the time when he brings Jesus to Virgin Mary, and then Virgin Mary has Jesus' friend with her at that time.
Okay, it's Jesus' her cousin, right? So it's her nephew as well. Okay, so you're suggesting that since John the Baptist is older, he's already there, and this could be likened to the Annunciation, where Jesus is being brought to him. Okay, I never heard about that. Never heard it put quite that way before, but I see that. So Jason, why do you think the other one is Jesus?
The angel's pointing at Jesus.
There is that problem, isn't there? The angel is pointing directly at the other one.
And I think it's like, well, I don't know if you have a zoom in on the angel's face, but to me, like right now, it's like the angel's looking at whoever's in the painting, so it's just like looking at the viewer and be like, that one's Jesus, and also like Mary's holding him.
Okay, there are 2 points there, right? One is that the angel is, looking out at us. We had a detail in a second. Let's go back. Boop. There. Yeah, so the angel's kind of looking at you, and your argument is that telling us who to look at, right? In case you're confused, it's that guy over there, right? And the Virgin Mary, whose job is to protect Jesus, right? We talked about this a lot of times. With the faithfulness of the blue robe, has her hand around that other figure as well, right? Good argument. Those are great arguments, right? Anybody else? Yeah? Go ahead, Liza. I think you beat her by okay, go ahead. Sophie.
I think the one by the angel is Jesus because it looks like he's teaching with his hands, and then the other one by Mary is kind of bowing down, kind of like it's Jesus.
Okay. What was this pose? We saw this pose before, didn't we?
Yeah.
he's blessing us, right? It's what the priest does when they perform the Mass. In Latin, it's peace be unto you, pax vobis. That's what they say, right? Peace unto you. And so that pose we've seen Jesus do a lot, right? The blessing pose. And then your argument, or your suggestion is that the other one is kneeling and praying to the one on the right. Right? Faisal, is that what you're going to say, or do you have something else?
No, I was just going to say about the one on the left. It's kind of leaning.
And so you're adding in, she beat you to the punch, as it were, right? Well, what we're pretty sure of, one, is that Leonardo wants this confusion, right? It's the same way he wants you to put it together up here, right, between your temples, rather than just with your eyes. Okay, so that's one thing. And it fits with what we know about him and the mystery he likes to bring to his pictures, right? The other thing that we've got as a bit of evidence is the fact that there are two versions of this. So this one's in the Louvre. Let's see what we got. There's that one. There's the other kid, right? Some of these details are really crappy. But notice the flowers going sort of into the shadows still. There's another one in London, which got the halos and the sharper, and we think it's Leonardo, but we think it was painted later. And maybe when this one was confiscated and needed to be replaced, right? Notice that there's a lot less sfumato in the background, right? It's just much clearer, right? And now, the boy on the left has got a cross. Okay, I might still say, but little baby Baptist always carries
Yeah,
the
that's
cross.
what I was going to say. Well, now I think.
Now it's John the Baptist, right?
See, that's the thing.
But you can see your points are exactly right, and that's exactly what Leonardo wants, is us to be able to sort of have to figure it out, right? He doesn't want to tell us up front. He wants us to figure it out. So the idea that Sophie brought up about the figure on the left praying toward the other one and the other one blessing is that's the key, right? The other things sort of get in the way, and you notice he's dropped the hand, right, in the copy. The pointing finger is missing, and the wings are a lot more obvious, and the angel looks over here, right, rather than out at us. So it's sort of a fascinating picture, right? So this was done now, like I said, for the Duke of Milan, who he had gone to work for in 1482, right? Duke Ludovico Sforza of Milan is Leonardo's boss, right? Commissioned the Madonna of the Rocks, commissioned one of the most famous pictures in the world, right? One of 3 or 4 we'll see that are the most famous pictures in the world. Also commissioned by Duke Ludovico Sforza. In addition to being part of this confraternity, the brotherhood, that prayed to the Immaculate Conception, he also gave money to a monastery. We've seen this. This is an old hat, right? Cosimo de' Medici did it. Philip the Bold did it. Give money to a monastery. It's a good work, right? And Sforza supported this monastery in Milan. And this was painted in the room where the monks ate, known as a refectory, right? Where they ate together. And that meant Jesus is always there, right? The doorway at the bottom was not originally part of it. That was cut through at a later date. It's suffered a lot over the years. Did you see the movie Monuments Men a few years back with George Clooney, right? The Monuments Men, in addition to getting works of art back that had been stolen, they were a group of art historians that worked for the military during World War II, right? Knowing that we were going to be attacking Italy and Germany, bombing them, many places of which were filled with great works of art. What are we going to do? And the Monuments Men's job at first was to advise the military on what they should try to miss if they could. Right? Please don't bomb that. If you have any way to not bomb it, don't drop a bomb there. And then after the war was over, was to go out and look for things that Hitler had looted and try to get them back. Right? The Monuments Men told the city of Milan that they're coming. And they sandbagged this wall on either side. And it's the only wall that stood of the entire monastery after the Allies bombed the bejesus out of it. Right? You can find images online of just this one wall standing with nothing else around it. So it's miraculous it survived it all. Right? So again, both of these commissioned by Duke Ludovico Sforza. The monastery has since been rebuilt. There's some of the ruins on the left and whatnot. And you can see how credibly, using perspective, that looks like that's part of our room, doesn't it? It's just like it just continues down the end there. He's created this space with those, on the walls there are these 4 wall hangings on either wall, in between which there are doorways, 3 on either side. The coffers in the roof and the ceiling, and even the table just frontally arranged. Everything is just in perfect perspective. Right? Now, you know the story of the Last Supper, right? This is Christ, Thursday of Passion Week, right? He's about to get arrested, tortured to death. He tells his apostles, one of you will betray me, right? And this Leonardo has chosen the moment when he says that. Now you'll notice typical Leonardo, no halos anywhere. We've got the 12 apostles around him, Jesus in the middle. You can read it pretty well, but there are no halos. Leonardo doesn't like painting things he can't see. Famous story about him. End of his life, he's working for the King of France. And his job working for the King of France was to just to be kind of fun to talk to at dinner. Because he was apparently like a really great storyteller, and you might imagine he's always investigating these stuff. Who would like to have dinner, Leonardo. And he got a job working for King Francis I of France, simply to be sort of Leonardo. He was hired to be himself, right? Reality TV star. And there's a story when he was back in his room, he's doing drawings and sketches, and he's late for dinner, so somebody sends somebody up to get Leonardo, bring him down for dinner. And they get there, and he's trying to draw a dragon. And what he's done is he's taken a lizard, he's caught a lizard, and he got a bird, and he cut the wings off the bird, and he's taken a piece of gold thread, and he's tied them to the lizard, and he hung it up from the ceiling so he could, now I can draw a dragon. Because he didn't like drawing things he couldn't see. He said that the eye is the ultimate God, right? Halos bother him, right? And he doesn't like it. But it works, doesn't it? Because the window kind of becomes a halo, right? So like nature itself is his halo. And you'll notice that behind Jesus are 3 windows. Right? The Trinity. Christ is part of the Christian idea of a 3-part God, right? And so the 3 windows back there definitely tie into that. In addition to this, it's a little hard to see, but there's a half-circle architecture element over the center window, right? And I've traced it here on my slide, but you can see it in the slide on the left. That actually makes a sort of halo around Christ, right? But it's a natural one. It's a real one rather than an artificial one, right? Geometry is a key part of this. Math is a key part of this. In fact, it's a huge part of the Renaissance. Rationality, measures, proportions, perspective, right? Jesus looks like an isosceles triangle, right? Or actually more like an equilateral triangle, which would also make sense because he's part of the Trinity. 3 parts the same, 3 angles, 3 sides, right? And so he uses this to underscore the composition. Okay? And with the idea of Christ as part of the Trinity, right? And also with Christ with his 12 apostles, you'll notice if you look around the room, it's just little subtle things, right? As he makes this announcement, one of you will betray me, the apostles sort of naturally break up into 4 groups of 3, right? 3, space, 3, Jesus, 3, space, 3, right? Across it. And 4 times 3. Well, you'll notice that we've got 3 windows in the back and those 4 hangings on the wall. 4 times 3, right? The ceiling is 36. It's 6 by 6. Well, 6 and 6 is 12 as well. Like there's nothing left to chance here. Everything has sort of been worked out, right? With the different elements mathematically, which Leonardo loves. And what he wants to focus on is the reaction of the different figures. Now, Leonardo thought he knew a better way to fresco, right? Standard practice, we learned about fresco painting, right? Water-based paint into wet plaster, okay? Works really great. Giotto, right? Fantastic. Masaccio, right? Fra Angelico. Good, solid, permanent works. Leonardo decided that he was going to paint in oil paint on top of dry plaster. And it didn't work. He's relentlessly investigating new ways, questioning everything that's ever been taught, and screwing up royally. Right? So it's hard to see, but many parts of this are just ghosts of what he originally painted. Right? The robe, the greenish sage-colored robe in the middle, for example. Right? Just a ghost. Even Vasari, our friend who wrote about the lives of the artists in 1550, he said you can hardly see it anymore because it started to flake off. Right? Our modern conservators have sealed down everything pretty well, cleaned off old varnish. It's not going to change much from this point on, but we have really only an echo of what Leonardo had originally painted. With the figures, he's telling the story in human terms. What he wants us to focus on are 12 different reactions to what Jesus has said. Because the Bible tells us that what happened when Christ said this is each one said, Lord, is it me? Am I going to be the one that betrays you? Nobody knows who it's going to be. Nobody knows what they can do. And each one of them is sort of pleading with themselves internally. And Leonardo tells the entire story in this sort of graceful manner with these figures. Right? I love the one in red who's sort of holding at his breast and looking up toward the heavens as he questions his own motivations and his own abilities. Right? The group off to the right discussing what it means. This isn't a miracle, right? This is human interaction between this group of 13 people who'd stayed together all this time. So we know who does it. It's Judas. Can you find him? Jason.
I remember being told he was on the left for some reason.
On our left.
Yeah.
Yeah. To our left. Definitely. Okay, look at the 12 apostles. One of them is going to be Judas. Does one of them look... Well, look at the lighting on their faces. Can you find one who's lit differently and not necessarily in a good way? Because what Jesus says is the one who sups with me, right? The one who takes soup with me is the one who will betray me. And Judas is already reaching for the soup that Jesus' hand is right next to. Right there. Right? He's lit dark. Everybody else is incredibly well lit. This is probably John the Evangelist, the apostle who Christ loved. Don't believe Dan Brown, who tells you it's Mary Magdalene. She wasn't there. Right? Leonardo wouldn't have done that. But Judas here is already showing, everybody else is going, maybe I could do it, I don't know. He's already doing it, right? Even having been told he's going to go ahead and go through with this. And you'll notice when you look at his face that he's not only is he dark, he's ugly. And he's kind of anti-Semitic. He's got a hooked nose and a big kind of chin, right? Leonardo wants us, again, what? Beauty adorns virtue, right? Remember Ginevra da Benci. Well, ugliness adorns the lack of virtue. So Judas, who's got evil in his heart, is going to look uglier than the rest of the apostles. Okay, so here's what's going to happen while I'm gone. I'll record something about her, so you'll find out about Mona Lisa, and because it goes back to Florence, this is back in Florence, right? So I'll do a short recording about her, then I'll have a recording about Michelangelo and a recording about Raphael, right? I'll sort of break it up into smaller sections, so that you don't have to sit down for a 45-minute online thing, because who wants to do that, right? And once they're up and running, and I should be able to get some of them up tomorrow before I go, I'll email you and say, okay, they're coming out now, and each time I get one mounted, I will get it up there. I think my hotel's got good Wi-Fi, so I will not only be able to answer your questions if you have any, but also be able to get this stuff mounted while I'm abroad, right? Now, today your draft is due, right? So be sure you get that to me before I get up in the morning, because I'm going to download everything and probably grade it at the airport.
The
Right?
bibliography.
Hmm?
The bibliography.
Bibliography, yeah, is due today. What did I say?
The draft.
It was a draft of the bibliography,
It is
right?
a-
It's a bibliography draft. Is due today. And I will get you comments back by, probably not tomorrow, Probably more likely Wednesday night, my time, which is so Wednesday afternoon your time. I'll be something like that. Okay? Yeah, we're going to Amsterdam. Yeah, so. Okay, so have a good week off, and we'll see you a week from Thursday.